Ask yourself this: what affects you more? A narcissistic person's indifference towards you, their withdrawing and their withholding, or their over focus on you and their anger at you? Drop in the comments which one is harder for you. Now, if you're out of one of these relationships, it certainly may feel like you are grateful for their indifference or detachment. But if you're in the relationship or can reflect back to when you were in it, you may remember that the detachment and the withdrawal and the withholding had an equal power or even a greater power than their anger. Some of how this affects us comes down, obviously, to our own psychology, our attachment styles, what we were exposed to in childhood, and the indifference and the clicking out that narcissistic people often do, and do stuff like the silent treatment. When they do those things, it can often feel like an abandonment. And their withdrawal, withholding, like I said, silent treatments or indifference, may be how they punished you, or how they behaved when they were not getting their way, or how they communicated disapproval to you. There would be no getting into them. And as a result, especially folks who grew up with a parent who did this sort of silent treatment, withhold sort of thing, you were almost trained to ultimately just give in to their version of events, or say what they want you to say, or do what they want you to do, just to get them to start talking again. And even if you didn't grow up like this may have been a pattern that you experienced in an intimate relationship with a narcissistic person. And then, over time, the indoctrination is complete. And we are, in essence, trained. We don't step out of line to avoid this discomfort and tension and abandonment. Now, contrast this to someone who is raging at you, screaming, yelling, agitated. You wonder if the neighbors can hear that they're yelling at you so much, kind of stuff. Even if there's no history of physical violence, it is this agitated, escalating, noisy anger, and it could have a similar effect. You may just give in to anything they want just to get them to stop yelling. And over time, you also learn to not step out of line and be what they want you to be, to avoid the rage, the anger, the disruption, and the fear. Now, the way that different narcissistic people express anger varies. The thing to remember is that anger is a central dynamic in these relationships, because there are so many things that make narcissistic people angry. And many of these things have nothing to do with you. It could be stuff that happened to them at work, stuff that happened to them as they were driving home, just even a thought that was going through their mind. But they may still displace their anger onto you. Some of it, maybe they're angry because you didn't read their mind, or that you didn't take them seriously enough, or you asked them to do something as ordinary as empty the dishwasher or put out the trash. Their grandiose sense of themselves, if you're asking them to empty the dishwasher, well, that's not coming true then. So they'll often push back angrily when people remind them that they are ordinary. So whatever it is that sets off a narcissistic injury in them. Any of you who grew up with a narcissistic parent knows that anger is really how the household was run. And so you really got good at anticipating it, avoiding it, and then as the pressure would build up, recovering from it. However, we're all affected in different ways by the different ways that narcissistic anger shows up. Because it is going to show up. It's not an if, it's an at what time. And because anger is inevitable and frequent in narcissistic relationships, we recognize that it can feel different depending on the kind of anger it is. And it can really mess with our heads, because ultimately, we aren't choosing between anger or no anger. We may be going back and forth between what kind of anger. Some folks feel that the raging anger at least means that they are interacting with me, that they recognize that I do exist, even if they are always letting me know what I did wrong. And that in contrast, that the withdrawing and what can feel like indifference and literally feeling like I don't exist, that feels worse. So it sort of becomes an existential question, doesn't it? Does the yelling at least acknowledge your presence? What does the indifference or withdrawing or the withholding activate in you? Does it hit on a sense of abandonment or the sense that you don't matter? That's also a pretty powerful feeling. Anger that is sort of overtly coming at us, like rage and yelling, although it's terrifying, can give us a sense that we do sort of matter, or at least we're worth yelling at, right? That the big bad narcissistic person is taking time out of their day to register us. And frankly, I think it all comes down to personal history. I'd never say any of this is a preference. None of us prefer any of this, right? The challenge that's raised by the withdrawing and silence and indifference is that you often feel like you're sort of living with this coiled spring that's going to pop. Whereas when they yell, they kind of get it out. And frankly, it often reduces their tension for them, not for you. And the yelling episode has what may feel like a finite end. And there may even be a reset. Narcissistic people often use their rage tantrums to regulate. They let it out, they feel better. And then they kind of start going about their day like nothing happened, or they might even be nicer to you. So it can create this uncomfortable kind of association between, when they get raged up, you know that then after that, things might actually get better for a minute. The silence kind of way of showing anger doesn't have that kind of effect. It tends to be more of a prolonged tension. Many people who have endured narcissistic abuse, either in childhood or adulthood, will report that anger in any of its forms is triggering and unsettling and leaves them feeling tense and sick. Interestingly, more survivors have said that while they hate the expressed anger and the fear and the drama, it did have a beginning and an end. And when that expressed anger was there, at least they felt like they did exist, right? The silence would create more tension in them that would last longer. Others, though, have said the opposite. They've said that the rage was terrifying and that with the silence, it was awkward and awful, but it was not nearly as triggering. So it's basically different kinds of poison, and our different histories are going to affect how we are impacted by them. The bottom line is that in most narcissistic relationships, sadly, you get both kinds of anger. So you know what both feel like. The indifference and the tantrums, the withdrawing and silent treatment and the yelling. So it's really not about which kind of anger do you choose. It's about seeing the patterns that different things set off the different kinds of anger. And that different narcissistic people might get different results from different people from their different kinds of anger. The ultimate result, sadly, is that usually narcissistic people get their way most of the time, while we get shaped into responding the way they want and slowly lose ourselves. Reflecting on how these different types of anger affect you can also shed light on how different phases of the relationship or even different narcissistic relationships have affected you. And whether you are being raged at or ignored, it pretty much sucks either way. And it can take a while to recognize that anger is a normal emotion and not just a tool of control. But in these relationships, we don't get to see that. And it's a good day when survivors can tap into their anger and not be scared by it. Thanks again.